So we're going to talk a little bit about the mechanisms behind some of the racial health inequities. And as we're talking, I want to make it very clear that we are talking about racism, not race. In the United States, health inequities due to race are largely due to both structural and interpersonal racism. Now, in medicine, we often conflate biological factors with race. And I know most of you are familiar with the concept that race is a social construct. And so this might seem like we are just going over the same thing over and over. But one of the reasons why I'm doing that is because as you progress along in your education, especially if you go into healthcare, this concept of biological determinism, some kind of genetic base to race, will just be reinforced over and over and over. And I can't tell you how many times people have come up with this antiquated idea that race is anything but a social construct, especially during the COVID pandemic, when we've seen so many disparities and inequities in health outcomes. Whenever we're talking about racial health inequities, we have to talk about Black maternal mortality and also Black infant mortality. We have some of the worst rates in the developed world, and that is largely due to some of the racial health inequities. So links between these unequal health outcomes and race or ethnicity are often chalked up to confounding differences in socioeconomic status or behaviors that impact health or access to healthcare providers. However, if this were the case, then they should disappear or at least diminish with increasing education and income. And while it is true that Black women are hit particularly hard by socioeconomic disadvantage, and while it is true that in general, education decreases infant mortality rates, when you look at the whole population, you still see racial health inequities, no matter what the income, no matter what the educational status. And if we look at this, so in New York City, with some of the highest rates of segregation in the United States, African-American mothers are 12 times more likely to die from a pregnancy-related cause. And you can see that, so the Black non-Latina mothers are in the red, white in the yellow. So education does make a difference, but there's not a big return on that education. And there's still a huge inequity between white mothers and Black mothers. And even when you look at, less than a high school degree, white mothers with less than a high school degree have much better health outcomes than Black mothers with a college graduate degree or higher. So socioeconomic status, education, and other factors do not appear to protect Black women from this risk. When we look at infant mortality rates for mothers aged 20 and over by race and education, we can see that the same thing that we saw in the last one. So infant mortality among white American women with a college degree or higher is approximately 4 deaths per 1,000 live births. For an African American woman, the rate's 3 times as high, so 12 per 1,000 live births. And babies born of white women who haven't finished high school experience a lower rate of infant mortality than college-educated women. So white women without high school education, Black women with college education. Furthermore, when we look at even higher levels of education, we see something really striking. So not only does the Black-white disparity for infant mortality exists at all education levels. So there is a difference at every single level. The darker purple is the Black mothers and or the Black infants, and the lighter purple are the white infants. And you see there's a difference at every single level of education, but it's greatest as you go higher in the education. Furthermore, you can see that the infant mortality rate after a bachelor's degree, so once you get into a master's or a professional level degree, is the highest rate of all. And so the author of this study interpreted this as being representative of the higher levels of discrimination that Black women might face in professional, after they get their professional degree and go, higher up in the career ladder. And that increase in discrimination and that increase in stress and that potential isolation, because there's not a whole lot of representation, right? Has significant effects on infant mortality rates. So this is a little wordy. I'll let you read it on your own. So it basically just says, it's not the socioeconomic status, it's not the mom's education, it's not the mom's behavior, and it's not the access to healthcare. Because controlling for all of these, we still see racial health inequities. So a lot of people still point to the genes. So here is a quote from 1967, and they concluded that only 1% of the variance in birth weight among infants was accounted for by socioeconomic variables. Furthermore, they concluded that race behaves as a real biological variable in its effect on birth weight. And this seems like a long time ago, but if these people aren't still practicing, the people that they trained are practicing. And so these ideas still exist and are very strong within medicine. In 1990 even, there's an assumption that Black women differ genetically from white women, and pretty much in every single journal article that's published, unless they're talking about racism, and sometimes even if they are talking about racism and they do acknowledge that it's a social construct, they still throw in the genetic argument that there's some kind of ancestry or whatever. And so we will point out the flaws with that argument. First, an example of just something I walked by and saw. So this study was looking at factors associated with excess weight in Hispanic infants and non-Hispanic white infants. So we're talking about excess weight in infants, okay? And what kind of factors were they looking for? Well, they did genetic analysis to look at the SNPs and to look at ancestry to try to conclude why there are differences in weight in infants. So how do we know that these differences aren't the effect of, inherent biological differences? Let's go through some of the reasoning. So first of all, the racial health disparities don't just focus on COVID, they don't just focus on maternal and infant mortality. You see these inequities or these disparities in cancer and stroke and diabetes, rates of kidney disease, asthma. And so it's very unlikely for any given population to have concentrated multiple horrible mutations in such a way that they are at higher risk for almost all of the common complex disorders on a genetic basis alone. Think of how simplistic our, genes must work if you could attribute every single one of these chronic diseases to some particular single nucleotide polymorphism. That's not very reasonable. Furthermore, look at these health outcomes that we see these disparities in. I want you to think of how the stress response system plays a role in most of these, because we've gone over most of these. And then as we go along, I want you to notice that you see the same pattern in marginalized and oppressed populations throughout the world. So rates of illness, rates of very similar illnesses. You see these disparities in the Aboriginal population in Australia. You see it in the Irish travelers in Scotland. And looking at this, I want you to notice, so here is the rate of health outcomes, and these are like disabling health conditions for white Scottish citizens in Scotland. And look at the African population. They actually have a lower incidence of disease. And then Caribbean or Black is still lower. And so there are only two different populations, Pakistani and the Romani or the Irish travelers, that have higher rates than the Scottish. You see the same effects and the same inequities in Palestinians in occupied territory. You see the same effect in, and this is looking at under 5 mortality rates in different ethnic populations, and we'll go through a couple of different countries, but this is Paraguay. In Kenya, there's lots of different ethnic groups and lots of inequities in the under 5 mortality rate. In the Philippines, same thing. And then when you're looking at caste system and child survival estimates, you also see inequities. So even if we were to assume that every single Black person in the United States were all like a homogenous group, which they're not, and you were to assume that there was no flow of genetic material in or out of the population, because that's one of the rules, right? When you learn about like the basic Mendelian genetics. But we know that's not true, right? We know that there's been lots of consensual and non-consensual reproduction between different groups and populations, lots of different migration. We know that skin color doesn't necessarily, reflect where you came from, especially if you traveled a long way. And so just assuming that it is a homogeneous population, an isolated population, so much that they would all share some kind of allelic or genetic difference that explained all of those different complex and chronic diseases. Well, when you see the same patterns around the world, that kind of blows that argument out of the water. How can all of these different people, all of these different groups of people share the same exact, biological determinant? They don't. It's oppression. Furthermore, going on the argument of ancestry, because that's kind of the next step that people tend to point to. Looking at hypertension rates among populations in Nigeria and Jamaica, what do you notice when you compare them to European populations? So the rates of hypertension are actually much lower in African, origin populations. It's only in the US Black and the US white that you see this switch. So it's probably not ancestry either. The other piece of evidence that we have is that health outcomes have improved in the past. And so here are the difference between infant mortality rates between white and Black population. And you can see that during the civil rights era and with all the anti-poverty movements in the 1960s and 70s, health outcomes improved among African Americans compared to whites. And so that actually narrowed the gap. And this is not long enough to blame evolution, right? Also, immigrants have better health outcomes. So when you are looking at Black mothers who have babies in the United States, when you separate the US born Black mothers and the African born, like immigrant mothers, the birth weights with the African born immigrants actually mirror our white population. And it's only the US born Black population that have the lower birth weights. But over time, this goes away. So we also see this for other ethnicities. So when you are looking at non-Hispanic Black population, US born, much higher infant mortality rates. So last time we were looking at birth weight, now we're looking at infant mortality rates. Foreign born, much lower. Mexican, US born, higher. Foreign born, lower. Asian Pacific Islander, foreign born, lower. US born, higher. And again, it's only for the white population that it, well, no, foreign born, lower. US born, higher. So this immigrant advantage is gradually lost. And generally, after someone's been here for about 10 years, their health status wanes. And then in terms of birth outcomes, the second and third African immigrant generation shifts over until it mirrors the African American. And that's what this is showing, that so this is the first generation, how you would categorize them. This is the second generation. And so here is US born Black with a very high percentage of low birth weight, especially at lower education levels. Foreign born Black is right here. And then for the third generation, they're the same. So immigrants, as they stay here longer, lose that protective factor. And this is reflective of all immigrants, not just African immigrants. And you can see that the blue bars represent the immigrants who have been in the US for less than 5 years. And for almost all of these, they're lower, as lung disease, diabetes, hypertension. Stay in the US for a little bit longer, you're going to get sicker. And once you're born in the US, much higher rates of illnesses for everything. That's not genetic. There's something wrong with our environment. Also, in case your brain starts to backtrack and attribute that immigrant effect to different gene pools, because that almost would make sense, right? Because we're different continents, potentially. But before your brain goes there, there is a way that we eliminate the disparities between Native and foreign-born women. And the way that we do this does not involve CRISPR. It involves education. And so looking at US born with the solid line, foreign born with the dashed line, and we look at Black, this is infant mortality. So you want it to be low. Here's the immigrant. And here's the US born. And as the US born gets more education, the infant mortality rates get closer to that of immigrant mothers or immigrant outcomes. Same for Asian, same for Hispanic, same for white. So that's not genetic. Also, the neighborhood impacts the immigrant effect or that protective quality, because as neighborhoods are more segregated, so as we go along this line, this is more segregation over here. The orange line is the foreign-born Black women. The blue line is the native-born Black women. And as we go up on this chart, we are talking about low birth weight. So in neighborhoods with low segregation, foreign-born Black women have much lower rates of low birth weight, so they have healthier babies than native-born Black women. But as neighborhood segregation increases, they lose that protective factor. And so if there's these two different ways that we can equalize the playing field, or at least get it more equal, with either education bringing the native-born Black rates closer aligned to foreign-born Black rates, or we can increase the foreign-born Black rates to match the native-born by just segregating the neighborhood. That's not a biological effect. That's an environmental effect. And it's not just for maternal and infant health outcomes. So structural racism is linked to hypertension. This was a recently published article that looked at over 3,000 different adults of different ethnicities and races for nearly 2 decades. So at the beginning of this study, they didn't have high blood pressure, and they followed them for 2 decades to see who got high blood pressure. They intermittently checked. They, tracked if they were on medicine, and then they would ask them about discrimination. And they compared everyday discrimination, which you see in the top of this table. So that's like the people being mean to you, the like interpersonal racism, versus the major life events or the lifetime discrimination. And that's really that structural part, like being excluded from job opportunities, from housing, from educational opportunities. And so what they found was a lifetime discrimination among Black people was associated with a 35% increased risk of hypertension. Interestingly, they didn't find a relationship between the everyday discrimination. The other interesting fact, and this is useful for people wanting to bring out the like reverse, racism or whatever. So Black people reported 65% of Black people reported lifetime discrimination, 42% Hispanic people, 40% white people, and 23% Chinese people. Now, the white people were less likely to say that it was due to race. It was probably due to other factors like gender or something else. However, only the Black people who were experiencing the discrimination actually were correlated to hypertension or increased rates of hypertension. So even though, other ethnicities and races reported experiencing these discriminations, there wasn't such a power imbalance that it actually resulted in adverse health outcomes. So it sucks, but it's not like life-threatening. So how does this happen? So we've been over this a few times. You have this, epigenetic programming of your stress response, and that's due to what your mother experienced, what your grandmother experienced, your early childhood, your prenatal experience. You have your early life stressors. You have your behavioral response. You have your psychological response, your inflammatory response. And all of that plays a role in this wear and tear. And we see that whenever we look at infant mortality rates. So this study is dividing white, Black, and Mexican mothers. And you can see that what makes sense is when you're really young, when you're a teenager and you have a baby, the rates of infant death are higher. And then as you get older, they drop. And then as you get to the other end, they go back up. And you see that for white mothers. And you see that for Mexican mothers. So as they have babies, like in the kind of 25 to 30-ish range, that's the most protective, right? But you don't see that for Black mothers. And so as they get older, it's actually more dangerous to have babies. And that is as a function of this like wear and tear phenomenon. So racial discrimination can result in these structural barriers, but they can also result in psychological stress. And so how do we differentiate this? We just went over some examples of the structural racism, but I want to show you why we also know that it is related to interpersonal racism. And some of this research comes from looking at major events that affected particular ethnicities and races in America. So in 2008, there was one of the biggest immigration raids at a meat packing plant in Iowa. And they arrested hundreds of workers, deported hundreds of workers, incarcerated hundreds of workers. And there were rumors, this was a little town, but there were rumors throughout the state that immigration was going to raid other facilities. They were coming after you. Families were torn apart. So it was very stressful. And so what epidemiologists did is they looked at the rates of preterm birth before the raid and after. So let's look at the chart. Before the raid, you see what you would expect to see. Foreign-born Latina mothers in the red have much better health outcomes. They have a lower percent of low birth weight babies, so they have, healthier babies than even white moms. And US-born Latina moms have the worst health outcomes. Then there was a raid about here. And you see foreign-born Latina mothers, the low birth weight babies dramatically rose. So did the US-born Latina moms, because the discrimination and the fear and the mistreatment and the stress from racism did not only affect people without documentation, right? It doesn't work like that. It affects everyone in that group, because the people who are doing the oppression, the people who are, participating in the interpersonal racism don't really differentiate. We also saw the same thing after 9/11. So after 9/11, people who were perceived to be Arabs experienced a period of increased harassment, violence, and workplace discrimination in the United States. This also correlated with an increase in adverse birth outcomes. So you saw 34% increase in low birth weight infants born to women with Arabic names. You saw 200% increase in infants given ethnically distinctive Arabic names. And that relationship was thought to be due to the fact that people who are strongly tied to the culture and maybe, show it outwardly, they would probably give their children more, be more likely to name their children Arabic names. And you saw that, you saw an increase in low birth weight infants. So we see this in Black women too. So African-American women who experience high levels of racial discrimination are 5 times more likely to deliver low birth weight babies. And this is about 37% of Black women who just report chronic worrying about unfair race-based treatment. And the interesting fact is that even just worrying about being discriminated against, worrying about having to deal with racism, or worrying that your children will have to deal with racism is a risk factor for having these bad health outcomes, because it was a experiment that controlled for the worry And when you controlled for the worrying about being discriminated against or having your children be discriminated against, the racial gap was eliminated. So that's really significant. So imagine you're an epidemiologist and you are looking at trends in birth rates and preterm births. What would you expect to see if you compared the birth outcomes of babies born in the US during the COVID pandemic to those born the year before? And what kind of racial disparities might be seen and why? So pause the video, see if you can answer, and then when you're ready, unpause it again. So if I had to guess, if I was the researcher looking at this, it would be complicated, right? Because so many people are under stress. I would expect people who maybe lost their job and weren't eligible for employment. So probably, Hispanic, Latina families, especially if there was someone who was undocumented in their family, I would expect there to be an increase in preterm birth and low birth weight because a lot of the COVID pandemic relief, you weren't eligible, even if everyone in your family was a documented citizen and there was one person who wasn't, so a husband who wasn't and the wife and all the children were, you didn't get any money. You were ineligible for all of that relief. And so I would expect inequities there. I would expect probably inequities in states that don't have the social structures and the systems that California has. You might also see some inequities and disparities in Black babies, but it would be a little hard because, racism is not new. Just because the rest of the country kind of woke up doesn't mean that this stuff hasn't been going on, especially in Black communities before the pandemic. But you might see some increase in low birth weight babies or preterm babies in Asian population, especially since that population is experiencing much higher rates of discrimination and violence. But we'll see. So one other reason why we know that this isn't a biological thing, it's not a cultural thing, it's not a behavioral thing, it's not a health insurance thing, it's not an education thing, it's not a socioeconomic thing, is because infant mortality also depends on the doctor's race. So this was a recent study that looked at infant mortality, and the higher the worse, okay? So they compared Black babies who were taken care of by white doctors. Infant mortality rates were way up here. Black babies who were taken care of by Black doctors, the mortality rates dropped significantly. So infants were 3 times as likely to die if they were Black and they were being taken care of by a white physician than if they were taken care of by a Black physician. And for the white babies, it didn't really matter who took care of them. They were okay. So that's not genetic. And now, you should be convinced, and you should be prepared to convince anyone else who comes up with that argument that 1, it's not a homogeneous population. 2, it's very unlikely that there's going to be a shared gene amongst all of the population that is responsible for creating adverse health outcomes in all the top causes of death almost. It's also very unlikely that you would see the same patterns in every single marginalized population or ethnic population across the world, who all look very different, right? We have changed these gaps in the past, in the very recent past. We know that people from the same race who are not born here have better health outcomes, and as they stay here, even just 5 to 10 years, that protection goes away. That's not genetic. We also know that, education or neighborhood segregation can alter some of those gaps. And we know that discrimination plays a huge role in, triggering poor health outcomes related to infant and maternal mortality. And the last thing is that doctor's race also plays a role. So that has nothing to do with inherited biological, risk.